My name is Tessa Morgan. I own a property management company in a town where people still measure success by job titles and last names. And every Thanksgiving, my father reminds me of that. There's something comforting, my father began, raising his crystal glass, about knowing one of your daughters saves lives. Soft laughter floated around the Thanksgiving table. 14 guests, polished silverware, a catered turkey no one in our family had actually cooked. And the other, he continued, glancing at me with that half smile I knew too well, make sure vacation rentals smell like lemon and bleach. More laughter, louder this time. I didn't react. I'd practiced that. My 9-year-old daughter, Lila, squeezed my fingers under the table. Mom, she whispered, is cleaning houses bad? Her voice wasn't loud, but it landed harder than my father's joke. Across the table, my sister Claire smiled politely, the way she always did when she didn't want to look like she was participating, even though she never stopped it either. Claire, the pediatric surgeon. Claire, the golden child. Claire, who had once fainted during med school and called me crying because she thought she wasn't strong enough. But tonight, she sat tall. Dad turned toward a sharply dressed man at the end of the table. Mr. Hawthorne here, he said proudly, is considering purchasing the North Lake parcel. It's been in the family for decades. Thought it was time to convert nostalgia into liquidity. Mr. Hawthorne nodded. He was calm, observant. Preliminary inspections went well. He said, we're just finalizing occupancy documentation. Dad waved dismissively. Old caretaker cottage. Vacant soon. Nothing material. I didn't move. I didn't breathe differently. But that word, vacant, pressed against my ribs. Because the cottage wasn't vacant. It hadn't been for 18 months. Claire finally spoke. Dad's downsizing some underperforming assets. Underperforming. I'd learned that language the hard way. Because 4 years ago, my company had almost collapsed. It hadn't been lemon-scented anything. It had been unpaid invoices, emergency payroll, and one contractor who walked off with equipment. Dad had told me then, real businesses don't almost fail. I had rebuilt anyway, slowly, carefully. This year, we managed 17 short-term properties, 2 long-term estates, and a seasonal portfolio that alone generated 6 figures annually. Not millions overnight. Growth. Real growth. Across the table, Mr. Hawthorne studied me for half a second longer than expected. Recognition flickered, then disappeared. Or maybe I imagined it. Dad raised his glass again. To success, he said. The kind that looks good on paper. Everyone clinked. I didn't. Because Mr. Hawthorne had just asked one quiet question that Dad clearly hadn't expected. Who's currently overseeing the lake properties? And for the first time that night, Dad hesitated. What he said next would change the entire deal. 4 years earlier, I had stood in a laundromat at 2 a.m., staring at my phone while 3 missed calls blinked from a property owner threatening to pull their contract. Back then, I didn't manage estates. I managed chaos. My first year in business had been promising. 5 cabins, a handful of local vacation rentals, decent reviews. Then winter came. Bookings dropped 40%. One cleaner quit mid-season. A pipe burst in cabin 3. Insurance delayed payout. Payroll was due. Dad had come by one afternoon, looked at my spreadsheets, and said flatly, "You built something fragile." He wasn't wrong, but he wasn't kind either. I refinanced my car to cover 2 months of operating costs. I negotiated new vendor contracts. I stopped taking a salary. That year ended with a $38,000 net loss. Year 2 broke even. Year 3 finally showed real profit. Not explosive numbers, but steady growth. By year 4, we were managing properties worth over $9 million in combined asset value. Revenue? Just over $1.9 million gross. After expenses, margins were strong, because we weren't a cleaning service. We were full-service property management, maintenance coordination, dynamic pricing, seasonal staging, vendor compliance, tenant vetting, and yes, cleaning. But only people who didn't understand business thought that was the whole story. Back at the Thanksgiving table, Dad was explaining the lake parcel. It's an emotional hold, he told Hawthorne, but business is business. Hawthorne nodded slowly. I'll need final occupancy verification before we proceed, he said calmly. Dad waved his hand again. It's vacant. My stomach tightened because I knew something Dad didn't. The caretaker cottage wasn't vacant. The current lease wasn't just active. It was managed by me. Hawthorne's firm had acquired a portfolio of regional lake properties last year, and I was the assigned operations director. We'd had video meetings, contract renewals, strategic calls. But tonight was the first time we'd been in the same room, and my last name, different from Dad's. Because after my divorce, I'd kept my married name. Across the table, Hawthorne looked at me again. Longer this time. You look familiar, he said. Dad laughed. Small town. But Hawthorne didn't laugh. He leaned back slightly, and then he said something that shifted the air in the room. I believe your company manages 3 of our seasonal rentals. Dad turned slowly. Excuse me? Hawthorne's eyes stayed on mine, and possibly the lake cottage as well. 14 guests. Complete silence. Dad's smile stiffened. Are you saying, he asked carefully, my daughter works for you? Hawthorne corrected him gently. No, he said. She works with us. And the deal that had seemed guaranteed seconds ago suddenly wasn't. But that was only the beginning. Claire hadn't always been perfect. She'd just always been first. First acceptance letter. First white coat ceremony. First to make Dad cry with pride. But no one talked about the night she called me from a hospital stairwell during residency. I don't think I can do this, she had whispered. I'd stayed on the phone for 3 hours. No one toasted that. Now she sat across from me, hands folded, engagement ring absent. Most people at the table didn't know she was in the middle of a divorce, or that her ex-husband had co-signed a private investment that collapsed. $220,000 in shared debt. Student loans still heavy. She wasn't drowning, but she wasn't floating either. Dad didn't know the full number. He only knew she was handling it. When Hawthorne mentioned my company again, Claire shifted. Dad's jaw tightened. So, you're telling me, he said, the occupancy issue runs through my daughter? Yes, Hawthorne replied evenly. And our due diligence flagged a lease extension filed last quarter. Dad blinked, because he hadn't read the full report. He'd skimmed it. Status had always mattered more than detail. Claire finally spoke. Tessa built that lease model, she said quietly. Dad looked at her, surprised. I asked her for advice last year, Claire added, on restructuring payments. The room shifted again, because now this wasn't just about a land deal. It was about something else. Dad's voice lowered. You never told me. Claire held his gaze. You never asked. The silence wasn't sharp anymore. It was heavy. Hawthorne folded his hands. We can't proceed without resolving occupancy, he said professionally. And given the management overlap, we'll need transparency. Dad stared at his untouched wine. For the first time that evening, he looked unsure. Not angry, not mocking, just unsure. And that uncertainty was louder than any joke he'd made earlier. But what happened next was something none of us expected, because Hawthorne didn't walk away. He made a different offer, and it would force Dad to confront more than just paperwork. It would force him to confront himself. The silence at the table stretched longer than anyone was comfortable with. Mr. Hawthorne didn't rush. He didn't posture. He simply folded his hands and looked at my father the way seasoned investors look at risk. Let's be practical, he said evenly. The lake parcel isn't the issue. The occupancy structure is. Dad straightened slightly. It's a minor lease. It's a legally extended management-backed lease. Hawthorne corrected, filed, documented, and attached to projected seasonal revenue. He turned to me. You forecasted a 14% year-over-year increase on that property. I nodded once. Conservative estimate, based on last year's winter occupancy and summer pre-bookings. 14 guests stared at me like I had just started speaking another language. Dad blinked. You projected revenue on that cottage? Yes, I said calmly, because it hasn't been underperforming. That word hit him. Underperforming. The label he'd used for both the property and, once for me. Hawthorne leaned back, slightly. I'm not walking away, he said, but I don't buy blind assets. I buy structured returns. Dad's jaw tightened. So what are you suggesting? A partnership. The word fell like a dropped fork. I'd rather retain partial ownership of the parcel, Hawthorne continued, and expand the rental model. The lake region is growing. With the right management structure, it's worth more cash flowing than sold. He looked at me again. And your daughter already understands the numbers. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't explosive. It was worse. It was logical. Dad had built his identity on selling, closing, converting sentiment into clean exits. But Hawthorne wasn't impressed by nostalgia or ego. He was impressed by systems. And tonight, those systems had my name on them. Claire broke the silence. Dad, you always said assets should work harder than pride. He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. Not anger. Recognition. Because the truth was, my father hadn't always been cold. He'd grown up with nothing. His own father lost 2 businesses before he turned 16. Security had become survival. Status had become armor. If people respected you, they couldn't pity you. And if they couldn't pity you, they couldn't dismiss you. He looked at me, really looked at me, for the first time that night. You never told me it was profitable, he said quietly. You never asked, I replied. Not sharp, just honest. Hawthorne closed his folder. I'll have my team revise the proposal. He said, but the management stays. Meaning me. Dinner resumed slowly after that. Conversations returned in fragments. But the dynamic had permanently shifted. Dad didn't make another joke. He didn't raise his glass again. He just sat there, quieter than I had ever seen him. And when dessert was served, he said something no one expected. After dinner, he told me, walk with me. And for the first time in years, I wasn't sure what he was going to say, because this wasn't about the deal anymore. It was about us. The air outside was sharp and cold. The lake beyond the yard was dark, still, indifferent. Dad stood with his hands in his coat pockets, staring at the water like it had answers. When you were 12, he began, you told me you wanted to run your own company. I remembered. He had laughed then, too. I thought you meant something safer, he admitted. There it was. Not cruelty. Fear. My father lost everything twice, he continued. Do you know what that does to a family? I stayed quiet. It makes you terrified of instability, of risk, of not looking solid. He exhaled slowly. When Claire became a doctor, I thought, finally, something no one could question. And me? I asked. He hesitated. I didn't understand what you were building. That was the first honest sentence he'd ever given me about my work. Not a joke, not a dismissal, just confusion. I almost lost it in year 1. I said quietly, I refinanced my car to cover payroll. His head turned sharply. You never told me that. You would have said I proved your point. Silence again, but softer now. He nodded once. Maybe, he admitted. Inside the house, laughter drifted faintly through the windows. Claire had stepped up tonight in her own way, not as the golden child, as a sister. I'm proud of you, Dad said finally. The words weren't grand. They weren't emotional, but they were real. I should have said it before, he added. Then he reached into his coat pocket and handed me a folded sheet of paper. It wasn't a dramatic letter, just 6 simple words written in his careful handwriting. Tessa, I see what you built. 6 words. Clear, unmistakable, accountable. Inside, Hawthorne was discussing revised projections with Claire. The partnership would move forward. Structured, transparent, profitable. Not because I humiliated anyone, not because I destroyed a deal, but because the truth held under scrutiny. And that mattered more. As we walked back toward the house, Dad slowed slightly. You were never underperforming, he said quietly. I didn't answer. I didn't need to, because for the first time, he wasn't speaking to the room. He was speaking to me. And sometimes that's the only audience that ever mattered.